preface for the beginning of this video. No, I do not support the idea of any conflict between any nations. That includes the idea of a US-Iran conflict. I'm from Alaska. Yes, it is part of the US, although we do function relatively separately, and we kind of act pretty separate too. No, I do not support many of the decisions of my own government. I am very critical of not only my own government, but basically the government of almost every nation on the face of the earth. There are a few out there who sometimes make smart decisions, but in my personal opinion, most governments of most nations are rather not intelligent. Now with that out of the way, hopefully we can actually begin. Alright, well, here we are. I know everyone was probably expecting me to talk about the current situation sooner or later. So tensions are up in the Persian Gulf again, following recent events, as the US and Iran keep playing this will they, won't they game. Now, I have spoken about this in the past, so some of you may already be familiar, but I have my own suspicions about motives behind things that are going on. As I've said before, I do think this is similar to the Iraq setup. That being, in the past, the collective intelligence community, or some portion of it, whatever portion deals with energy behind closed doors, they were almost certainly aware that the first peak in global oil production was coming in the mid-2000s to late 2000s. And so I suspect the whole WMDs thing was thrown out there to give, a public motive for the Iraq invasion. But I also suspect the real motivation was twofold, in that, as anyone can see now, Iraq is pumping around 4.5 million barrels of oil a day, and was nearing 5 million barrels per day at one point, and could in the next couple of years get up to 6 million barrels per day, and has always been capable of getting up to 6 million barrels per day, and potentially even higher than that. However, in the past, they never really did that. They never really went higher than 1.5 million barrels a day, sometimes 2 million barrels a day. And they also didn't actually export at any huge ratio, because their own domestic oil consumption level in the past, pre-invasion, was actually pretty high at certain points. So the whole invasion served a twofold purpose of, one, bringing the outside industry into Iraq and quickly ramping up Iraq's oil production to what levels it was actually capable of all along. And at the same time, the war itself devastated Iraq's economy and basically crashed the country's domestic oil consumption levels, so that the overwhelming majority of that new, much higher level of oil production was then and now being exported. And the reason for doing so was to basically have that sudden upsurge in Iraqi oil production provide sort of a buffer against the first peak in global oil production, or I guess you could rather call it sort of a dampening effect. And it did work in a sense. The first global oil production peak didn't necessarily turn out to be a peak, in that it didn't actually hit the top of a parabola and then start falling down. It kind of flatlined and lost a little bit over the course of 2005 to 2008. And if that huge upsurge in production from Iraq hadn't been there, then there most likely would have been a much more visible decrease. Though even with that dampening effect that Iraq provided, the global oil demand during that time still ended up overshooting supply by 2 million barrels a day, which led to $147 per barrel oil prices, which inevitably brought about the whole global economic collapse that is supposedly now over, but we common people know it really isn't, and it's never going to be. We're just going to keep repeating the process. But so, the point behind all of that being that I suspect, I'm not sure, as no one's ever sure of the future, but I suspect that the same thing is relatively being put forward behind closed intelligence doors. The same sort of proposition of doing the same thing to and in Iran that was done to Iraq. I believe that same consideration is being made because Iran is in a similar-ish position. Not necessarily the same, but in a pretty similar position. Iran still has a lot of oil, but Iran is capable of pumping at a rate of about 6 million barrels per day, and they might actually be capable of higher, but they are capable of pumping at 6 million barrels per day for sure. They could hold that production plateau. However, since before the revolution, they've never really returned to that production level. They've only ever gotten up to and held a plateau of about 4 million barrels per day, and only for certain periods of time. And Iran's own domestic oil consumption level is near 2 million barrels per day. It's a little bit under it, but it's pretty close to 2 million barrels per day. So even when they are pumping 4 million barrels per day, they're consuming half of it themselves. Only half is being exported. So I suspect, unfortunately, that the consideration is being made, in the very least, to enact sort of the same type of operation with Iran that was done with Iraq. Create a pretense, start the war, the invasion. The war cripples the domestic economy and infrastructure, so their own oil consumption collapses. And then after the initial conflict, their oil production is brought back up as quickly as possible to their full capability. In this case, we'd assume 6 million barrels per day. And this inevitably acts as a sort of buffer or dampening effect towards the coming second and potentially final global oil production peak in the 2020s, which we are now in. I personally suspect that peak is most likely going to come in the mid to later 2020s, but you can find out about that and many other things in our 2020s decade video about predictions and stuff. There's a link to that in the corner and everything. So I unfortunately suspect that that's the sort of underlying aim or the underlying motivation behind everything. As the saying goes, all wars are fought over only two things, resources or religion. And as my saying goes, in reality, almost all wars are fought over resources. And in the cases of the ones that are supposedly fought over religion, religion is just being used as the excuse to get people to fight over resources. In the case where those in power feel that their people would not willingly fight over resources. And keep in mind, religion does not specifically apply to faith. It applies to other things, anything that ideologically can motivate a person, like on either side of the conflict, patriotism. So I believe that's the aim or the motivation behind it. And as I said previously, the last time I spoke about this, back in either June or May of this past year, I definitely didn't expect that any real conflict would actually start until at least September, because that was, at that point at least, the time frame that Iraq had set for when they would finally be relying on other nations for natural gas imports for their power plants instead of relying on Iran. Because if any conflict had started before that point, then Iran would have a big trigger they could easily pull. They could just cut off Iraq's power supply, in which case then all their fields couldn't operate, so their 5 million barrels of oil a day would instantly vanish from the market. So those in power were, and still are to an extent, waiting for that obstacle to be out of the way, because that deadline was not met, and numerous delays have constantly come up, and Iraq, as of what I remember, I'm not entirely sure, but they were not expecting to be completely free of Iranian natural gas until early this year. But since the whole oil tanker incidents back in late spring, the U.S. has constantly, sent an additional 1,000 troops, another 1,500 troops, another 1,000 troops, now another 3,000 troops, and, some B-2 stealth bombers here, another couple squadrons of F-22s there, an additional carrier strike group into the Persian Gulf on top of the one that's already there. So again, I will absolutely pray that it does not happen, but unfortunately it keeps rolling in the direction of it most likely happening. And I'll praise God if it doesn't, but it seems to be leaning in the direction of likely to happen. Although a new bump has been thrown in the road in the form of the Iraqi parliament voting to evict the U.S. military from Iraqi soil. So I have no idea what that would do to any potential time frames of anything. Alright, that's it for me for this one. So thanks anyone who stuck around and listened. Please like the video if you'd rather everybody not kill each other. Subscribe if you want. We talk about energy and resources all the time. Other videos and stuff up on screen if you want to watch them. PayPal's in the description for anyone who wants to help me out. May God protect you all, and I will see you all around next time.